Hello, everyone, and good evening. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's talk. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Damon Silvers, a distinguished visiting professor of practice, labor markets, and innovation at UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. This is the second of a two-part lecture series by Damon. Damon is, as mentioned last week, a former deputy chair of the U.S. Congressional Oversight Panel for Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP, served as the director and policy special counsel for the AFL-CIO, served on various governmental advisory committees, including the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Research Advisory Committee, and the Advisory Committee on Auditing Professions, and its Financial Research Advisory Committee. Tonight's discussion builds upon last week's exploration of the 2008 financial crisis, looking at the long-term political and economic consequences of the bailout, so things like austerity and quantitative easing, and the price of those changes with regards to the neoliberal policies that would affect different types of political stability and economic performance, highlighting key lessons that remain pertinent or most pertinent for understanding this contemporary moment with regard to the rise in authoritarianism or authoritarian power. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Damon Silvers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nye, for that generous introduction. Once again. I'm Damon Silvers, and I'm, as Nye said, a visiting professor of practice here at University of College London's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. This is the second of two lectures looking back at the 2008 financial crisis. Based on, while there's plenty of facts and data in it, really the core of these lectures is drawn as befits a professor of practice from my experience in the midst of the financial crisis, both representing the U.S. trade union movement and as a member of the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP, which was the U.S. bank bailout. This lecture looks past, the first lecture last week was really an attempt at a pretty tight narrative account of what exactly happened in the financial crisis, with a focus on the United States and to a somewhat lesser degree the United Kingdom, but with a bit of a view around the world. That lecture, which is on YouTube, by the way, if you didn't see it, that lecture seeks to basically lay out the facts in a sort of analytic manner. This week's lecture is about something else. This week's lecture is about the legacy of the financial crisis. And the legacy beginning quite early, meaning not just how it looks from today, but how events evolved once essential financial stability was restored in 2009. And this lecture is less of a kind of tight narrative. This lecture is an invitation to you to think about it. To think about what is the legacy of the financial crisis for contemporary global society, and particularly for the societies that matter to you, whether that society would be the one that we're actually physically in the United Kingdom, or wherever it is you may be or wish to build your career around the world. That's the frame here. And if you find that if you find that there's more questions than answers, that was the idea. So let me begin. I think they're going to bring me the paper copy, what makes it easier for me, but for the moment, we'll just go with the slides. So the thesis of this lecture is that the financial crisis of 2008, although it is now more than 15 years ago in its inception, which was really in 2007, that the financial crisis of 2008 is still with us. In fact, is the fundamental shaping event of the contemporary world, of the world we live in today in 2024. We're going to review today the economic legacy of the crisis, the intellectual and cultural legacy. And I might say just on that point, it's just a beginning, a dipping of the toe into the water on the question of the intellectual and cultural legacy. In many ways, I leave that to you, my audience, to build on and understand further. The political legacy. The political legacy is as Nye indicated, a critical focus of this talk. And I believe today is the most concerning aspect of this story. Where the political legacy of the policy choices made during the crisis period has led us as a global society. And finally, keeping the fact that we live in a global society in mind, the impact on global governance, the impact on how the world, not individual countries, but how the world functions as to whatever degree it is, a single economic, financial, and political unit. So let me just start off by reviewing what I said in the last lecture. The last lecture was a complex story of how the financial crisis that really began visibly in 2007 emerged from an environment characterized over a long period of time, decades, by wage suppression and lack of demand, of aggregate demand in an economic sense, financialization and deregulation in the world's major economies, and particularly in the economies of the English-speaking world and their sort of dependencies, like Iceland, for example. And so our story really began with that environment and how the financial crisis emerged out of it. The critical point of last week's lecture was that the policy response, not everywhere at every moment, but in most places, the policy, and in most major sort of specific moments of the crisis, the policy response favored bailouts over restructurings of troubled financial institutions. And that had major implications economically, and politically. Third point of the last lecture was it's very important to understand that the financial crisis and austerity are distinct events. They represent a set of distinct policy choices. One was obviously triggered by the other, right? But one was not inevitably triggered by the other. And we're going to come back to that in some more detail today. And then finally, because I'm not going to focus today on the contrast between bailouts and restructurings, I want you to remember the point from the last lecture, which is the contrast between bailouts and restructurings when it comes to the implications for insider accountability. To what degree were the executives and public officials involved in the decisions that led to the crisis held accountable for their acts? To what degree were investors, who in a capitalist system are supposed to be money at risk, to what degree were they actually money at risk and responsible for their decisions? And secondly, the macroeconomic impact, the degree to which a financial crisis sparked by poor or perhaps illegal business decision-making, the degree to which it actually affected the real economy, the degree to which it affected the real economy. So just, again, these are points I'm not going to focus on. These are points I'm not going to obsess about today, but which I want you to remember as we go through what I am going to obsess about, because they are the critical foundations of what we're talking about today. So, we'll begin with the economic legacy. The financial crisis, as we discussed a bit last time, the financial crisis permanently altered, of course, what is permanent in human history, but at least from the perspective of today, the financial crisis permanently altered the economic situation of those countries that either put their chips, so to speak, on financialization as an economic strategy, or embraced austerity, or most disastrously did both. Now, some countries found, in the end, alternative paths to sustain growth out of these circumstances. So to some degree, and we'll come into it later, the United States both embraced financialization quite significantly. Perhaps of the world's major economies, only the UK did so to a greater extent, and embraced austerity, although, as we'll come to, less so than the UK and Europe did. But it found an alternative path, partly in ultimately Keynesian sort of debt-led growth, but also through its tech industry and through its dominance, through the United States' ability to leverage its dominant position in the world economy and the world financial system through the dollar. Ireland did something similar on a much smaller scale. Ireland was able to use, to essentially create itself as a high-tech tax haven and draw an enormous amount of economic activity to it and produce an enormous amount of growth, even though initially the impact of the financial crisis on Ireland was among the most devastating of any country in the world. But other countries did not. Other countries who found themselves in this trap to varying degrees found themselves unable to escape it. And the most significant one, I think, the data shows today, is the one we're sitting in, the United Kingdom. And I'll come back to this over and over again in case you get tired of it. I warn you if you're going to feel tired of hearing it. Where the UK ended up after the financial crisis is really quite striking. Less well known is the fact that Germany's economy in many respects has never quite recovered, meaning that Germany has not suffered. Germany's starting point was a healthier economy than the UK's, and Germany's per capita income is higher, and Germany's industrial position is better. But relative to pre-2008, Germany has had difficulty getting sustained growth as a result of some dynamics that we'll speak to that similarly affected the world's large developing economies. And then finally, there were countries in such weak positions in this situation within their regional economies, so weak economically, but also critically weak politically. There were countries in such weak positions that they had their standard of living significantly and permanently reduced. So the UK story is a story of stagnation. The Greek story is a story of absolute national income decline. And that's what you see on the wall. That's Greece. That is Greece's GDP. And that sort of mountain there is the run-up to the crisis and the aftermath with EU-imposed austerity that followed. And as you can see, there's really no recovery. There may be recovery someday, but it hasn't happened yet. And we'll talk about Greece some more. So this is sort of the broad stroke economic landscape that follows the financial crisis. Now, it's really important to understand in detail austerity. Austerity was the decision to reduce budgets, to reduce government spending, right? And to the degree politically possible, bless you, to the degree politically possible, not just to reduce government spending, but to actually accumulate surpluses by governments in response to economic decline following the crisis. So countries that were facing reductions in GDP and reductions in their ability to service their sovereign debt decided in response to reduce their government spending at a time of already reduced aggregate demand and recessionary or depressionary conditions. That's austerity. Austerity was a popular policy response to the financial crisis, which it was thought was the manifestation of essentially profligacy. Right? The financial crisis occurred because people were too wild in their spending and borrowing, and therefore we need to pull back. That was the kind of, in many parts of global culture during the period from 2009, 2010, 2011, that was the explanation. Now, I think in retrospect, austerity was an unmitigated disaster. A disaster economically, and then more importantly, a disaster politically. But it needs to be dug into a little bit. So the first thing to understand is that anyone with any knowledge of economic history should have known it would be a disaster. Right? The idea of cutting back spending while your economy is in free fall is a recipe for further free fall. Now, in the case of the situation in the developed world in 2009 and 2010 and 2011, these economies were not in free fall at that time. Right? They had that period was in 2008 and early 2009. The stabilization of the world's financial system had slowed that free fall period, but these were all economies suffering serious lack of demand and at risk of slipping back into recession. Why do I say this was a known fact? Because austerity, under different words, was essentially the approach taken by the world's major liberal governments, not neoliberal, liberal governments, in the period of the Great Depression. The policy response of the German government in 1930 and 1931, the United States government under Herbert Hoover, a variety of British governments, most tragically the first Labour government under MacDonald, in response to the Great Depression was to say, well, if we have an economic problem, we've got to cut spending. This produced the free fall that led to the rise of to Hitler's coming to power in Germany in 1933, and also to the catastrophic defeat of the Herbert Hoover government in the US 1932 elections. It was known that cutting spending in the face of a financial crisis would lead to disaster, but it was known by a previous generation of economists who had died. In this context, and this is a good point for this institute, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is devoted to the idea in part that economic ideas matter, it is worth noting that part of what propelled austerity as a policy choice across the developed world was bad scholarship. Not just forgetting what had been known about the past, but paying attention to really shoddy work that was treated as if it was gospel because it had numbers. Right? There were these two quite well-known economists, Reinhardt and Rogoff. They wrote a paper in which they said that the data proves that any country that has more than 100% of GDP in national debt is headed for a currency crisis and an economic collapse. They wrote that paper. Nobody paid, it sounded good, and it met the ideological inclinations of a variety of people around, particularly in the European Union and in sort of conservative circles in the United States. It got a great deal of attention, and then it turned out that two things were true about the paper. One of them was that the key data points were tiny Pacific Island countries. And the second thing that turned out that somebody I know at the University of Massachusetts showed, and then that paper kind of went away, was that the math was wrong. I mean, literally wrong. The arithmetic was wrong. Now, I have not, we could spend the whole hour talking about why the arithmetic was wrong, but it was. And that paper is no longer viewed as a serious contribution to this literature, but it actually drove real decisions and destroyed real lives. The second thing, and I just remember a particular moment in this that I was really struck by. The second thing that drove austerity was what I would call bad ethics, right? Bad social thought. Bad scholarship is kind of straightforward. Bad scholarship, statistically insignificant data points, poor arithmetic. I mean, that's bad scholarship. Well, what is bad ethics? Bad ethics is the making of really serious decisions with giant consequences based on essentially prejudice. And that is hard. It's hard not to look at the environment, particularly in the European Union, and in this country, in the United Kingdom, during the period from 2009 to 2014 or so, when austerity was imposed, and not see that happening. I don't know if people remember what the acronym PIGS stands for. Right? The acronym PIGS doesn't sound very nice, does it? It doesn't sound like the sort of thing that is a positive form of social conduct. It's an acronym for 4 countries: Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. And this is how their brothers and sisters in the north of the EU referred to them. Now, you would never know from the use of that kind of acronym and the kind of message that sends. And by the way, this was heavily sort of pumped up by things like The Economist and the Financial Times and Der Spiegel and so forth. The sort of voices of supposed tolerance and globalism. Right? The theory about this was that these countries were greedy and profligate and were somehow taking what they didn't deserve out of the European Union and the global economy. As I discussed last week, what this whole thing kind of missed was that they were providing the market to the virtuous people in the north, that it was a circle. Right? That the only way, given the imbalances in income between the north and the south of Europe, the only way to make the European Union work as an economic system was to have the north lend money to the south to buy the north's goods. until productivity and incomes could be more equalized across the European Union, this was the only way to make the EU work. And who was more at fault in that? It's not, thinking about fault isn't the right way to think about it, except in the sense that there was a failure, a fundamental failure in European governance to address the profound inequality in the European system, which had deep roots. That inequality had deep roots. If you looked into it, you would discover that each of the pigs was to varying degrees the subject of a right-wing dictatorship in the post-war years, right? That did things that kept incomes down. Right? Italy's dictatorship was sort of dressed up as a democracy, but in fact there were a bunch of institutions keeping a tight grip on Italy in the Cold War. The other countries, Portugal, Greece, and Spain, all had actual military dictatorships that imprisoned trade unionists and shot them. Now maybe that explains why there might be an income imbalance. And you could go back from there. And obviously, as I put on the slides, this stuff is racist. This is a racist discourse that helped promote austerity and in the end hurt everybody. And then finally, and this had more impact in the US, I think, than in Europe, the politics and the ideology of seeing government itself as the problem. Right? Whereas in fact, as anyone who knew anything about this type of situation, where you face downward pressure from a financial crisis, government was the only solution. But the notion that government itself was the problem, the myth that government subsidies had somehow caused the financial crisis, or that government social policy had caused the financial crisis, which wasn't true, as I went through last week. That myth fed the idea that maybe that we should pull back on government, that government was the problem. The term starve the beast is an American right-wing political term for fiscal policy. Now, this graph here shows you, this graph was titled, Following Austerity Measures, Greece's Economy Collapsed. And that's true, the red line is Greece. And it's real GDP, it's a different graph than the other numbers I showed you before. But that's not why I put this here. It's not for Greece. It's for EU total. EU total is the middle line, or it's right in the center there. It's barely above 100, it's barely above the benchmark 100% in 2018 off of 2007. Right? This is the consequence of austerity, 10 lost years, right? In one of the world's 3 largest economies. An economy that barely went anywhere for 10 years. And what happened politically while that was happening? Now, talk a little bit more. I talked about Greece because I got excited, but I'm going to talk about Greece some more because I was involved in this a little bit. I did a little bit of work with my friends Jamie Galbraith and Yanis Varoufakis, who were briefly the actual Treasury Department of Greece. And here's what this was. The EU, as I think everyone knows, the EU has a common currency, a central bank, a set of fiscal rules, and a little bit of revenue sharing. But the EU's fundamental fiscal structure is at the national level. The revenue sharing is dwarfed by the national budgets. And the EU emerged from the crisis in 2010. In 2010, the sense that the banks might fail imminently across Europe had eased a little bit. Europe emerged from this period with really no sense of being a truly common economic and, more importantly, political unit. So that meaning that, and this is what the acronym PIGS tells you, is that important parts of the Europe's governing elites simply didn't see everybody as being part of a single community. Obviously, important parts of Britain's government elite didn't see it as being part of Europe. That would be, Boris and Jacob Rees-Mogg and so forth. But even within Europe, there was this sense of us and them. And so when Greece, which is one of Europe's poorest countries, couldn't pay its debts to the German banks, Germany refused to restructure the debt. They refused to take steps to ensure that Greece's economy would be healthy, which, by the way, is the only real way of ever really being able to pay back the money. Instead, what they did was they routed money from Germany. They gave Greece relief, but the relief was specifically required to be paid right back to the German banks. It wasn't about Greece at all. It was about propping up the solvency of the German banks. And meanwhile, Greece, which had bet its life as a nation on the European project, was left essentially to starve. This created a situation illustrated in the cartoon. You see the little man as Greece is looking at a table with a bottle of ouzo, and on one side he has the knife of budget cuts, on the other side the pistol of exiting the euro. And he has to choose which poison, which weapon. This illustrates this situation as clearly as I remember it, which was the question of if we do the budget cuts the Germans are demanding to paper over what they're really doing, which is round-tripping money to their banks, if we do that, we'll put our country into economic decline for a generation. If we pull out of the euro in the midst of a financial crisis, it's unclear whether we'll have a banking system the next day. This real decision was confronted the Prime Minister of Greece at the time, Alexis Tsipras, and his finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. They had a disagreement. Yanis felt that they should pull the plug on the euro, and his boss disagreed and felt that the best thing to do, given these horrible choices, was to make some kind of deal with the Germans. Yanis discovered that prime ministers actually outrank treasury secretaries, and now he's a famous public intellectual. And they went with the budget cuts. I happened to be around this time, I happened to be at a dinner in Brussels with a number of people who were very consequential in the European governance system, former prime ministers and this kind of thing. And things got very tense very fast at this dinner. It was supposed to be all friends. They were all people who were in the kind of social democratic wing of Europe, and they had all worked together in the European project for many years. And all of a sudden, it felt like a Buñuel film, you know? It felt like people were going to be reaching for guns. And in the middle of all this, the former prime minister of Austria, who was kind of the guy you might imagine being the former prime minister of Austria, he was a sort of square man with a large cigar. He turned to me and he said, "How did you solve this problem?" Meaning, how did we solve it in America? And I said to him, "We solved it at Appomattox." Now, of course, being the Austrian prime minister, he didn't know what Appomattox was. Appomattox is where the Civil War was settled. Appomattox is where General Lee surrendered to General Grant and ended the American Civil War. And by that I meant that we had a military conflict over whether or not the states were one whole thing economically and socially or not. Right? And obviously the main issue in that conflict was slavery, but a subsidiary issue was, like, are we bound together economically or not? Or we just go do whatever we do? Now, the funny thing about that answer, I realized years later, was that the EU actually had an Appomattox. The EU was founded out of the war, out of the settlement of the Second World War. Except it didn't. Except they didn't internalize over time in the decades past the recognition that it's one society. You can't have a unified currency without, in some sense, unified fiscal structures and a unified labor market and unified standards of living. If you try to do what they're doing, you end up with perpetual conflict. And they're slowly moving that direction. But Greece was the horrifying example of what happens when you don't, and of what austerity meant as a response to the financial crisis. Now, go to something completely different. The strange case of the United States, going through the economic outcomes. The strange case of the United States and austerity, which you don't often hear too much about. Austerity is often talked about as a European phenomenon, but in truth, it was wildly popular among economic intellectuals and elites during this period. It was all the rage at the OECD. I remember very well being at the meetings. I remember telling the head of the OECD in a closed-door room in Davos, if you insist on austerity, you will get war. And he looked at me like I was a madman. I'm wondering if he should buy me a drink, like a White Russian maybe. But what happened in the United States? In terms of understanding the common narrative here, it's equally compelling. So the first thing to understand that you may know is that last week we talked about the United States' bank bailout. At the same time as the bank bailout went on, President Obama, the newly elected president of the United States, and the newly elected Democratic majorities in both Congresses passed a large classic Keynesian fiscal stimulus. $800 billion of borrowed money injected into the US economy over a 2-year period called the ARRA, the American Recovery and Relief Act, or colloquially, the stimulus. Huge deficit finance public spend. Unlike what was going on in Europe, a classic textbook case of what you should do in response to this type of crisis. What was the problem? The problem was it wasn't big enough. Last week I said Paul Volcker, the kind of grand old man of American financial regulation and economic policy. Paul Volcker said at the time that the downward force in the economy when the ARRA was passed was stronger than that of the Great Depression at its peak. Great Depression ended up a 25% decline in GDP. How big should the stimulus have been? Well, there's an anecdote out there. I wasn't there. This is not my anecdote. There's an anecdote out there that President Obama asked that question of his economic advisors. And one economic advisor, Larry Summers, said, I'm sorry, no, it didn't go this way. He asked Christina Romer, who's a very famous economist from Berkeley, but not a terribly astute politician. And Obama asked her, how much stimulus do we need? And she looked at her spreadsheets and she said, we need $1.5 trillion. And Obama turned to his legislative advisors and said, can we get $1.5 trillion from Congress? And they said to him, well, not with any Republican support, we can't. And Obama was hoping to get Republican support. He never got any. They didn't vote for anything. He was hoping to get Republican support. And he said to his advisors, well, how much do you think we could get through with Republican support, or at least how much could we get through easily with Democratic support? And they said, well, $700 to $800 billion. And Obama, who was not an economist, turned to the economists and said, well, will that do? Will that work? Well, will that fix the economy? And Larry Summers, who was a more astute politician, raised his hand and said, Mr. President, if that's what you need, that'll get the job done. Well, turned out not quite to be true. So the truth was that Christina Romer was right, that the actual amount of money needed to get the US economy quickly back on its feet was more like $1 to $2 trillion. And I think that's now been pretty well established by the people who run big models. But there was another problem, and this is the IIPP problem. This is the problem that those of us who study here at this institute should be really attuned to. There was no sense of mission or public purpose associated with the way the stimulus was described to the American people or asked for. Instead of saying we have important work to be done and we're going to take this opportunity to do it, it was more like, well, this is actually wrong. Borrowing money is wrong, but we have to do it. Now, if you know anything about politics, this is a terrible way to sell anything, right? And it's also wrong. It's mistaken. This line, it's wrong, but we have to do it. Given the deficits in US public investment at the time, given that our infrastructure was being given a D rating by the civil engineers, given the looming threat of climate change, which the Obama administration said they wanted to do something about, this is completely mistaken. But it was what the ideology of market fundamentalism demanded. So a year into the stimulus, so after grudgingly doing this half-powered stimulus, a year into it, the administration advisors, just get too uncomfortable with doing something they feel is wrong, and they start talking about, quote, fiscal consolidation. The fiscal consolidation, in case you ever hear that word, like in a bar, fiscal consolidation is it's a euphemism. It's a euphemism. It's a polite phrase for austerity. It's a polite phrase for budget cuts, for cutting back. So in 2010, and you can see now, over here, this is actual deficits. And the deficits, in terms of stimulus, if you're trying to get the economy moving, deficits are a good thing. So the top purple line is 2009. That's when the stimulus has its full impact. It starts falling off in 2010 and 2011, 2012. That period there, as the deficit falls off, is the period when Americans feel the economy slowing down. And all through 2010, the Obama administration says, well, we don't really want to spend more money. The economy slows. Then the Republicans won the 2010 congressional election because, more or less, partly because of outrage over the bank bailout, and partly because of the slowing economy, and partly because Republican ideological messages started to get traction. And I'll come back to that, right-wing messages. The Republicans get control of Congress, and they impose real austerity. The Obama administration sort of hemming and hawing. Republicans get in, and they demand large budget cuts, which is what they do when they are in office and there's a Democratic president. When there's a Republican president, they do regressive Keynesianism. They do large unfunded tax cuts. When there's a Democratic president in office, the Republicans in Congress do austerity. They do austerity because they believe that borrowing money to spend on the public is wrong, borrowing money to spend on tax cuts is right. So they want to cut back on government spending and cut back on borrowing. And as a result, you see a serious drop in deficit spending here. But the serious drop in deficit spending produces an imminent recession. So by 2011, the United States economy is in danger of going into recession. Into that space, as the fiscal brake is being applied very hard, and if you were around during that time paying attention to politics, there was all this stuff about government shutdowns and fiscal crises and all this kind of thing, grand bargains. The American politics was really fiscally dysfunctional during this period. But meanwhile, there's this huge fiscal contractionary force, and in response, the Federal Reserve, our independent central bank, steps up again. If you recall from last time, the Federal Reserve put enormous amounts of liquidity into the US economy using monetary policy in 2008 and 2009. They back off a little bit, but then they hit the gas in a big way in 2011, right through 2014, with quantitative easing, buying long-term bonds, not just moving down the short-term interest rate, but moving down the long-term interest rate. And so the US economy during the period of 2011, 12, 13, 14 is a driver with one foot on the brake and one foot on the gas. And that is the peculiar story of US austerity. In the end, the Federal Reserve wins. In the end, Trump comes in and does regressive tax cuts, but long before he does, the US economy starts to get close to full employment because of the force of monetary policy. Right? And Obama was successful in holding off austerity enough so that monetary policy could take up the slack. And he wisely appointed Janet Yellen to be Fed chair to replace Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen believed in full employment. And she kept her foot on the gas during this period, whereas others might have done differently. Now, that is a strange and sort of perverse story, but not a terrible story in the end. For a bad story of the aftermath, we're talking about this country, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom's embrace of austerity following the crisis produced a multifaceted disaster. Now, I should have put this up there. There's a famous story about how when the Tories came into power in 2010, they found a note saying there was no more money. Right? That anecdote is one of the most destructive anecdotes, in my view, in this country's history. It's kind of like on a par with peace in our time, because it justified a series of catastrophic economic decisions. Right? It was a myth. I don't know whether the note existed or not. It doesn't matter. It was a myth that justified terrible decisions that blighted this country and the future of its young people to this day. Because it's not true. In really profound ways, it is not true there was no more money. Money is not a thing like that. It's not like a rock. Right? Money is something different. It's an expression of the productive capacity of the society. And there's plenty of productive capacity in this society. Now, what happened was hard austerity, hard budget cuts, on top of the fact that this society, the United Kingdom, was the most vulnerable of the world's major economies because 20% of its GDP was related to financial services when financial services radically contracted. And the UK's financial services base was a global base. So the UK was even more exposed than other societies because it wasn't just its own demand for financial services, it was servicing global demand. So the consequence of putting a hard fiscal brake on top of a financial crisis for a country completely dependent on the financial sector was long-term economic stagnation, stalled productivity growth, because what did you defund when you did austerity? You defunded education and healthcare. The UK broke its workforce participation numbers. It broke its workforce productivity. It damaged its transport system. It did all these things that hurt productivity growth, which was, of course, the way out. And then, at the peak of the negative impact of austerity is the Brexit vote. The Brexit vote is clearly connected. The Brexit vote, and I'll come back to it more, the Brexit vote has deep roots, but it's clearly connected with the lived experience of the British people during this period of austerity. And Brexit made it all worse. The financial crisis broke Britain's pre-crisis economic model, which was financial services dependent. And the truth is that in the now 15 years since then, under conservative government, no new model has been developed. It's like a car whose engine is broken and just kind of goes slower and slower and slower. And you can see that in this line. This is net disposable income per capita. It's a very, very insightful number because it tells you about people's lived experience. How much money do you have in your pocket? And the reality is that while there's been slight upticks and one big downtick, that's COVID, that this peak, which is right before the financial crisis, is kind of more or less where it's kind of bumbling around ever since. And that's 15 years. Now, it's kind of worse than that in a way. The lingering features of the old model of financial services-driven growth are actually preventing the effective embrace by Britain of a new one, which, in terms of public investment. Because public investment is the key thing that has to happen here in order to deal with productivity, and it's just not happening. And the key reason is because the tax system is designed to attract financial services business, not to fund the people of Britain. And it's clear, by the way, that there is no graph that looks like that for any other major developed country, any other major economy in the world post-2008. Every other major economy is either driven by other things or has basically seen some meaningful growth. In retrospect, Britain, which was the most financialized major economy in 2007, has suffered the worst of any major economy from the financial crisis. And part of that was hard to see how you would avoid given the financial dependence, but part of it is just terrible policy, of which austerity is the center. Now, the BRICS. We talked a little bit last time about how the BRICS was a huge story and too much to talk about, but I want to just make this one point about the BRICS. The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They're the biggest economies in the developing world, and to call them the developing world at this point is probably a misnomer, particularly China. They're a huge force in the world economy. The BRICS were much less affected by the financial crisis than the developed world. There were different reasons for this. The Indian bank regulation remained very old school, very tight. China just walled off its economy in various ways, mostly through the use of currency, just walled off its economy from developed country debt instruments and developed country bank risk. And in part, it has to do with the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, which the BRIC countries took far more seriously, the lessons thereof, than the United States and Britain did, who felt that that was a problem for those people and not for us. But now, 15 years later, you can see that just as was true for Britain and less so for the United States, the long-term growth rates in the BRICS diminished post-2008 as their markets in the developed world shrank in real terms. So you see there on that graph, that's the BRICS economic growth. That big downward spike there is COVID. You can see it peaks in 2007 and it's slowly kind of diminishing. Right? The BRICS have not had the kind of robust growth that they had before the financial crisis. even though they were fairly insulated from the crisis itself. You don't see the big dip there in 2007 and 8 that you see in the US and the UK. But you see this long, slow decline. Now, I think that this is in some way related to the rise of more authoritarian and autarkic politics across the BRICS, particularly in India and China. Right? I think there is not enough understanding of what is driving political change in those two countries, and particularly in China. But this graph would suggest that something is going on under the surface that's about more than the kind of internal personal dynamics of the Chinese Communist Party. There are pressures at work, and reasons why Chinese political players are less enthusiastic about economic integration with the West than they were before the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the long-term impact of the financial crisis and the ghost of Keynes. I like talking about the ghost of Keynes. So here's the ghost of Keynes haunting Barack Obama. We're actually sort of smiling on him because Barack Obama was, in fact, a good Keynesian, at least in the first year of his administration. As I said in the last lecture, in some ways, the financial crisis was caused by the effort to use financial markets to do what Keynes thought government should do. Essentially, to have private parties and poor people borrow money to try to stimulate the economy rather than governments who can pay it back. The realization that this is more or less what had happened and the huge cost of it, particularly in the US, turned the Obama administration's economic advisors back into orthodox Keynesians. They'd been sort of Keynesians in name only. So they became real Keynesians in the sense that they believed that they went and borrowed $800 billion to stimulate the economy, at least for a time. But it took a long time and a lot of needless suffering for the IMF, the OECD, and the EU to do the same. In fact, it took them until after the full sort of disaster of austerity had fallen on them for them to begin to look differently at the role of government in the economy, which they did just in time for COVID. By that time, though, as we'll come to, the political damage was largely done. How this sort of ambivalence during the post-financial crisis period in relation to Keynesian economics, the resistance on the part of fiscal policymakers and right-wing politicians to deficit spending, and the lack of international macroeconomic policy integration, which is a big fancy term for what I just showed you in Greece, led to a reliance on monetary policy to make up the difference. Central banks stepped in when politicians couldn't to do essentially Keynesian maneuvers, but to do them with monetary policy rather than fiscal policy. And this kind of gives birth to modern monetary theory in an interaction between theory and practice. And while much better than austerity, I want to be really clear about this, I think central bank intervention during this period and during COVID was a good thing. The alternative was disaster. But expansionary monetary policy without active bank regulation, really active bank regulation, financial market shaping of the most robust kind, if you don't do that, the credit flows to speculative ends and tends to drive up inequality and exacerbate social tension. So I think good fiscal policy would have been a much better thing, but in the absence of that, monetary policy would have had to do. It should have been accompanied by active bank regulation. And instead, the tendency to inflate assets across the board that came from allowing the banks to lend money to people like Elon Musk has fueled underlying economic and political problems. Now, if that's economics, let's talk about ideas and culture after the banking crisis, after the financial crisis. The financial crisis, the ideas that underpin the neoliberal order, market fundamentalism, the idea that markets, quote, unregulated markets, and we understand that that's a myth, right? Markets are always regulated, always shaped. But the idea that somehow markets by themselves would produce the best of all possible worlds, that idea had been under pressure already from events since the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. But the crisis of 2008 and the way it came about, its clear link to deregulation and financialization, marked the end of market fundamentalism as a dominant and even as a living set of ideas in mainstream political economy. From here on out, the set of ideas that dominated the 1990s and early 2000s in economics were essentially zombie ideas. They still were embraced for various self-interested reasons, but nobody really believed them. And I show you here the contrast between the environment in the 1990s and that after the financial crisis. This is Time magazine from the Asian financial crisis. The man in the front is Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, the man who thought that it was not a good idea to regulate subprime mortgages. To his left is Bob Rubin, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary. He was the man who promoted and advocated the deregulation of the banking system in the 1990s. To his right is Larry Summers, his successor as Treasury Secretary. Larry Summers pushed the deregulation of derivatives in the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. But at the time of the Asian financial crisis, they were seen as the saviors of the world. And this is Alan Greenspan, the man in front of this photo, in the fall of 2008 at a congressional hearing. I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, was such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders. He might have added what he actually believed was that they were best capable of protecting the public. It wasn't just their own shareholders, it was the public that he foolishly thought these people would take care of. But this whole ideological structure collapsed in the financial crisis. What came in its place? Quickly, three different interpretations of the crisis came to the fore. First, and you'll recognize these things at work in social media today. First was, and this wasn't the first one that came to the fore, but it came to get a lot of momentum. Market fundamentalism betrayed, meaning that crony capitalism, crooks on the inside, had prevented the true working of a libertarian utopia. Right? And this narrative got momentum on the right throughout the developed world. In the 2010 Republican Party platform, right-wing populists all over the world basically embraced this narrative, and it has some very ugly underpinnings, some very ugly anti-Semitic and racist underpinnings have become associated with this narrative. It's not fundamentally those things, but it has an affinity for them. The second narrative that got going was the idea that basically neoliberalism was wrong. It was the wrong set of ideas, and that in fact the sort of more traditional social democratic and New Deal ideas that came out of the Great Depression and the Second World War would be worth a second look. And in the United States, this was associated with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the United Kingdom with John McDonnell and ultimately Jeremy Corbyn, with Mélenchon in France, with Lula in Brazil, and with a whole bunch of academics and intellectuals, including the ones who sit in this building, to be fair. And then there was a third school that got some momentum as the financial market stabilized, and that was the we made a few mistakes school. The we made a few mistakes school was the idea that really this was just like a technical problem. That the financial crisis was a technical problem, and we just needed to do it a little better. And you saw this coming from places, some people in the IMF, some people in the European Commission, and some people who were close to Barack Obama, like his Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, and Larry Summers, whom I mentioned earlier. They might dispute my characterization of this, but they didn't think deep structural reform in the neoliberal system was necessary. I think they would agree with that. Now, these three narratives, I think you'll find, are the dominant narratives in our culture today. Not just about the financial crisis, but about what we should do with our economy and society generally. But something else happened. And this is, I think, really a deep issue and one that I can't do justice to, but that I want to raise. Which is the financial crisis coincides with the birth of the smartphone and the birth of today's sort of hyper information environment, total information environment, and the birth of social media, and the birth of what some people refer to as kind of a post-truth environment. Now, what happens when a world run by technocrats and algorithms fails? Who do we trust? When the world seems more unpredictable, more bizarre than social media conspiracies, how do you sort it out? Who's telling the truth? Things that actually had relatively little economic significance but were associated with the financial crisis in this context took on huge cultural significance. Bernie Madoff, this rather distinguished looking gentleman here who ran one of the largest stock frauds in human history, a firm that invested the money of many very prominent Americans and actually turned out not to invest it at all. Actually had no stocks, nothing. He just spent the money. The presence of people like this in the sort of backwash of the financial crisis, economically is insignificant, but embodied the idea that we live in a world of sinister conspiracies, and like anything is possible. Any crazy story could be true. And what actually happened, not Bernie Madoff, but what actually happened to the banking system, right? The sudden collapse of many of the world's largest financial institutions, the breakdown of the financial system itself, as I discussed last week, the disappearance of liquidity, the fact that the world's largest institutions were afraid to trade with each other overnight, the discovery of large-scale fraud like the robo-signings, which then no one did anything about, this created and justified and fed a culture of paranoia, right? Which then intersected with all of the things embodied by Mr. Musk over here in terms of technology, wealth, power, and paranoia. This, in my mind, is summed up by the following statement that was made to me by one of the most important people in the United States at the time, who had a long history of work on Wall Street. And he said of the heads of America's major banks, "I thought these men were honest men, if tough competitors. I learned I was mistaken. Not one could be trusted." Now, how do you go on and then run the country if you believe everyone you're talking to is lying? A second issue, or third issue, is the impact on the young. People who came of age after 2007, and I'm afraid I'm lecturing to an audience for whom this is your life, so I feel sort of silly doing this, but people who came of age after 2007 in much of the developed world faced a much more hostile world economically than their older brothers and sisters or their parents. Key aspects of their lives had been financialized and turned into things that looked kind of like subprime mortgages. In the United States, particularly education, in much of the developed world, housing. Jobs were not available post-financial crisis, partly because of austerity. And when they became available, they were precarious work. A generation of baristas and Uber drivers living in their parents' homes. The chart on the side is the employment rate of young people around the world after 2007. It just goes down and down and down. There were economic consequences that were measurable. Productivity growth didn't happen. Household formation didn't happen. But the human consequences were and are large-scale and profound. Nothing like this, no generation has been economically blighted like this since the Great Depression. And at the same time, though, and this creates, I think, real cultural conflict and tension, and political conflict and tension, a minority of young people, those involved in high-level tech and related fields since the crisis, have come to enjoy great affluence, in some cases great power. So the experience of this generation is highly bifurcated, with a vast majority experiencing precarity. This dynamic, which has now been going on more or less, and COVID amplified, has been going on for half a generation, 15 years, is going to shape our culture and our politics for the rest of our lives in ways that we have yet to fully experience or understand. Its roots predate the financial crisis, but the financial crisis is when it exploded. Now, again, for IIPP, there's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of the legacy of the financial crisis, in the paradox of the state as an effective shaper of markets. As I went through last week, governments in the economies most affected by the crisis were able to stop the runaway liquidity crisis in the fall of 2008 and early 2009 and turn the financial system back on through public policy interventions. Very rough, kind of seat-of-the-pants stuff, but it did work to restore liquidity. And in significant ways, the aftermath of the crisis involved governments consciously shaping financial markets, whether they admitted they were doing that or not. Very Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose type thing, shaping markets. These things happened around the crisis and its immediate aftermath, even as the zombie ideas of market fundamentalism kept marching on, and even as the people who were doing the market shaping claimed they were somehow just fixing a few things here and there to allow markets to be perfect like they were before. This activity, in my mind, looking back, created the beginning of new confidence in government structures to do the work of market shaping, which then bore fruit in the effective government responses to COVID and in President Biden's investment agenda in the United States today, which is the most effective thing going on in the world today to address climate change, and was the subject of my climate lectures 3 weeks ago. And so in a way, the financial crisis and its aftermath, despite all of its flaws and profound problems, may in retrospect be seen as the first step to effective action on climate change. Here's my friend Hank Paulson expressing just the horror of what he was trying to do to restart the financial markets in the fall of 2008. And the question is, did that moment and the relative effectiveness of him and his team at restarting the financial markets, did that lead to President Biden and $3 trillion of good jobs and windmills and the chance to bring climate change under control? We'll see. Not about politics. There was financial regulatory reform that followed the financial crisis. The US, the UK, the EU, the G20, they all moved to strengthen financial regulation. The UK, this is the first thing that happened politically after the kind of triage, after the crisis management. This was the first thing that happened. The UK, a little later, abolished the regulatory agency that had become the symbol of weak regulation in the 90s, the Financial Services Authority, the FSA, in 2013. Much earlier, I should have reordered these bullets, the United States Congress, while the Democrats still controlled the Congress, in 2010, the United States Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, comprehensive financial reform legislation. But then the banks got political power back in 2010 with the Republicans, and a substantial part of Dodd-Frank was weakened or not implemented. And important pieces are only being implemented today by the Biden administration. Impressively, and to the everlasting credit of Elizabeth Warren, who was the leader of this, the Dodd-Frank Act created an independent consumer financial regulator, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the United States, for the first time. The UK followed suit slightly thereafter in creating the Financial Conduct Authority. The G20 created a global organization to monitor financial stability, the Financial Stability Board. The common idea of all of this, which was kind of the compromise between the people who really wanted profound structural reform and those who thought a little tinkering would be okay. The common idea here was that everything that did financial intermediation, no matter what it was called, needed to be regulated to make sure that it wasn't financially unstable and that it didn't set off a cascading effect as subprime mortgages had. But the results were mixed when it came to actual structural reform, to separating more and less speculative financial activity, more or less risky financial activity, genuine market structuring of the kind that would be needed if we wanted our financial markets, for example, to fund affordable housing or deal with climate change. And so there's a kind of half full, half empty quality to all of this reform. That being said, we have not had a financial crisis of the kind that we had in 2008 since, and we had several before that. And so in my judgment, at least in the stability zone, these reform efforts were somewhat successful. And I'm very proud to have been involved in the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, this is step one of political response. Step two, though, was a political shift from third-way governments, from left neoliberal governments of the kind that Tony Blair or Barack Obama embodied, or Bill Clinton even more than Obama, to governments of the right. Financial deregulation and crony capitalism was perceived by the electorate in the developed world as a project of left neoliberalism, of center-left governments. It's not fair. The Bush administration, a right-wing US government, is probably the most responsible single government for the financial crisis. It's not fair, but it had some basis. And center-left politicians paid the cost of their embrace of failed right-wing economics. The Tories win in 2010 in the UK. The Republicans gain control of the US House of Representatives in 2010. The Brazilian Conservatives topple the Labour Party government in 2014. The Christian Democrats have sustained control of the German government throughout this period. And there is a distinct tilt right in the European Commission that explains some of what I was describing in terms of austerity. Now, I think I went through much of this already. In the United States, the Republicans combined, this is the mechanics of this kind of seizure of power. The Republicans in 2010 combined an attack on President Obama for the bank bailout, which was actually structured by President Bush, and with the idea that, so they attack him for bailing out rich guys, big bankers, with the idea that somehow this actually has to do with the Democrats' sympathy for poor people, and particularly people of color. You begin to see the rise of racist themes in American politics in this campaign. Obviously, it's not lost on anyone that President Obama is the first African-American president when this collection of arguments is put forward. There's the notion in this campaign in 2010 that the stimulus is threatening the stability of the dollar. This goes back to the Reinhardt and Rogoff foolishness. While the Republicans are attacking the Democrats for being soft on the bankers, the Republicans are actually raising huge amounts of money from the financial sector and promising them that they will cripple the implementation of Dodd-Frank, which they effectively did try to do. And using this campaign, which is completely inconsistent, but quite astutely targeted at various audiences in the context of bailouts and austerity, the Republicans win control of the House of Representatives, which they then use to weaken financial reform. The counterpunch to all this, the counterpunch to bailouts and right-wing politics, is then the emergence across the developed world of social democratic and New Deal politics, as I said earlier. This is, you can see Occupy Wall Street looming in the background there. So you see the rise of mass movements that are not left neoliberal, but are actually robustly social democratic. Political movements for public investment, progressive taxation, strong regulation of finance and tech, and with growing focus, movements supporting the rise of trade unions, and particularly among young workers. You see this in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Lula, countries that were dominated, where neoliberal politics was completely hegemonic, the rise of a different kind of robust and visionary left politics. And even in China in this time, you see this happening. It is completely suppressed by Xi starting in 2014, but between 2010 and 2014 in China, you see the beginnings of independent trade unionism and and explicitly left-wing critiques of China's version of what I would call state capitalism. Again, you can't find them anymore, but they were there. But the next stage was the rise of right-wing authoritarianism and racism. In the financial crisis, as I said, bailouts, impunity, and austerity discredited market fundamentalism. But these events also weakened and discredited democracy itself. And this, I'm afraid I should really have blown that line up. That's the most important line in the whole talk. Large elements of the public in developed countries in the aftermath of the crisis, looking at bailouts and austerity, however they understood it, felt that they were being governed by a conspiracy of the wealthy and the powerful, and not really by their fellow citizens. The simultaneous resurgence of social democratic policies as a response to this feeling led to alliances forming between angry, alienated parts of the electorate that had a right-wing bent already, and business interests and the wealthy who feared taxation and regulation from the resurgent left. By the late 20-teens, the authoritarian right is ascendant globally. Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, the National Front in France, the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, you could go on. There are other, Netanyahu in Israel. And then there's the peculiar case of President Xi in China, the return of an authoritarian cult of personality in a society that had strongly renounced that very form of government for decades. the cult of personality. The authoritarian right has both business support and popular support. And everywhere it appears, racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and climate change, opposition to action on climate change, are a factor in its rise. What you see behind you is January 6th at the US Capitol. Now, Brexit as a case study in this. Brexit, as I talked about 2 years ago in my lectures, last year, in my lectures on Britain's industrial history, Brexit had deep roots in the trauma of British decolonialization and deindustrialization. But the proximate cause was the long-term economic stagnation set off by the financial crisis and the austerity that followed. And the sense that, quote, we, whomever we were, no longer were in control of the decisions that mattered in, quote, our country. And while Brexit made the stagnation worse, there was an underlying truth that the ECB and the European Commission were pushing austerity and repressing wages in the years prior to the Brexit vote. Brexit's promoters are part of the rise of the authoritarian right. And they promised Britain their kind of story. A Britain in command of its fate, with fewer immigrants and engaged in productive activity rather than finance. Of course, they delivered none of it. But it really has to be understood as part of the rise of an authoritarian politics, even though it didn't have an authoritarian mechanism in its initial form on the surface. Donald Trump. Donald Trump and the financial crisis. Donald Trump played no role in the financial crisis because he was an insignificant figure in American business since his bankruptcies in the early 1990s, this is a beautiful picture of Donald Trump being pursued by his creditors in the 1990s. But he played a business leader on TV in the show The Apprentice. And in the 2016 presidential campaign, he ran on the platform of it takes a thief to catch a thief. He said, we need people to go after these financial criminals, and I know how to do it because I am one. Donald Trump's campaign sought to identify Hillary Clinton, his opponent in 2016, as associated with Wall Street, and in particular with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs, there are many important and powerful players in the financial crisis. Goldman Sachs was one, but by no means the most important. Why was Goldman Sachs the focus of Trump's attack? Well, partly because Hillary Clinton got a fee from Goldman Sachs, but there was another reason. Trump resurfaced anti-Semitic dog whistling in the 2016 election that hadn't been seen in US politics at the national level since the 1950s. References in his campaign literature by his campaigners on the ground, which I heard in Florida, references to the Rothschilds, to George Soros, and Goldman Sachs as our hidden masters. Somewhat ironic in terms of the fact that the right is now yelling about anti-Semitism. They woke anti-Semitism up in American politics in the 2016 election as a way of mobilizing popular rage over the financial crisis. In reality, the Trump administration was extremely pro-Wall Street and staffed by Goldman Sachs executives. But his campaign promoted conspiratorial rhetoric and authoritarian government as a cure for corruption and plutocracy. I gotta say here, there's a quote you should all remember. It's very useful in our times. It comes from the German socialist leader August Bebel, who famously said, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Now, more broadly, prior to the crisis, during the heyday of neoliberalism, authoritarian states and cults of personality seemed artifacts of the past. Saddam Hussein, Slobodan Milosevic, they were like guys who hadn't gotten the word that Stalin was dead. They even had the mustaches. Even in China, as I've pointed out, where authoritarianism was pretty strong, collective leadership and gradual liberalization seemed the order of the day for decades. But by 2014, the trend is clearly in the other direction, toward authoritarian states and cults of personality. It started in smaller countries, Orban in Hungary, the Polish right wing, but then you see Putin, who held power, escalating his level of control, Xi, who again came up through collective leadership, asserting himself as a cult of personality, and then across in previously democratic societies, Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, and even in his kind of champagne glassy way, Boris Johnson. Now, and so that brings us to today, the rise of the authoritarian right. Finally, it was a global crisis. What did it do to global institutions? Several of the world's leading major multilateral institutions in the aftermath of the crisis engaged in extensive rethinking of how they approach political economy. The IMF and the OECD, I would call in particular, I was involved in both processes. They did their best to rethink what they had been doing. The new multilateral institutions were created, the Financial Stability Board, as I mentioned. But the fundamental political architectures of these institutions were not changed. And so the older developed countries remained in a position of dominance in those institutions, and the BRICS remained kind of out. They were members of them, but not in the driver's seat. But the BRICS saw, and particularly Russia, China, and India saw, that the neoliberal order was just not as strong as it seemed. Now, what did this lead to? First, this led to, in a very positive way, a different kind of response from the IMF to the next serious crisis, which was COVID. In COVID, the IMF moved to provide resources to developing countries who might otherwise have found themselves in debt crisis through something called special drawing rights. This was a substantial change and is a positive one for the international structure looking toward the crisis of climate finance. Those parts of the neoliberal international order that were most committed to neoliberal ideology, the World Trade Organization in particular, seemed in its aftermath to be adrift, and still significantly are. You don't hear much about the WTO anymore, where it was a leading institution of change in the 1990s. As I said, the BRICS, and particularly Russia, India, and China, learned from these events that the neoliberal fabric of international governance could be ignored. And this has led to dramatic failures of the international security system. The deep roots of the Ukraine war lie in the financial crisis. And the intractability of the Gaza situation does as well. The fantasy that Gaza is the direct outgrowth of political alliances between the Trump administration, the Saudis, and the Israelis. And the fantasy that right-wing authoritarianism can cut deals out from under the people that are actually being affected. And Gaza and Ukraine is deeply rooted in Putin's conclusions that Europe was weak after Brexit. These events, the tentacles of these events lead back to the financial crisis and to austerity. The financial crisis and the political and economic post-financial crisis moment remains with us. And it has left global society with a choice. The right-wing authoritarian response, drawing energy from racist, anti-climate, and plutocratic forces in global society, or the democratic left response, linked to anti-racist, environmentalist, and trade union agendas. What had been the dominant political force before, and economic force before the crisis, neoliberalism, is now the center that will not hold. And if you look at pressures surrounding this conflict, you can see the ambiguous actors trying to find ways around this dichotomy. Danish social democrats who are anti-immigration, Macron and Blairite politicians trying to keep third wayism, neoliberalism alive, US Republican senators who insist they are right-wing but are on union picket lines. They're all trying to figure out a way around this very hard to get around choice that global society faces. Conclusion. 4 points broadly about the aftermath, about the financial crisis. First, about financial regulation itself. The "this time it's different" trap. If you hear that phrase, "this time is different," or "this is genuinely new in finance," run the other way. Paul Volcker, my friend, famously said, the only financial innovation since the Renaissance that's been of any good to anyone was the ATM. I'm not sure that's true, but these things that are now present in financial markets, shadow banking, cryptocurrencies, they represent attempts to do unregulated financial intermediation. You should never allow unregulated financial intermediation. Doesn't matter what you call it or whether you do it with cowrie shells or Bitcoin. It can't be allowed. It has to be regulated. Financial markets must be regulated for what they do, not what you call them. Secondly, financial markets shape what societies are. They're not just another market. They're how the fundamental resources of modern societies are allocated. Fairness matters, and what happens as a result of how financial markets are structured and regulated, what happens to working people matters. It matters economically, and it matters politically most of all. Thirdly, the social and political model that underlay neoliberalism, that underlay the policies that produced the crisis, the idea that all we needed was the right economic incentives, that we didn't need a culture of respect for law, that we didn't need cultures of solidarity, that we didn't need a sense of common purpose, that we didn't need a sense of democratic legitimacy. That set of ideas, which was taught in all of the world's leading universities during the 90s and 2000s, is completely and utterly wrong. And anyone who was involved in any of humanity's great efforts in the modern world could have told you that. It's just they didn't teach it at Harvard. And not only were those models wrong, they were incompatible with democracy. They promulgated a vision of human nature and of how human beings interacted with each other that could not support democratic societies because it was fundamentally dressed up, prettified a war of all against all. And from an IIPP perspective, the bottom line is democracies not only can shape financial markets, they must shape them if democracies are to survive. And so finally, the meaning of the crisis of 2008 remains with us. The crisis remains with us in tangible ways, but its ultimate meaning is up to us. Is the meaning of the crisis that it destroyed public confidence in democracy and the rule of law, empowered would-be strongmen and neo-fascist coalitions, crippled our capacity to fight climate change when we needed it to do so? Or is it that it broke the hegemony of a really destructive neoliberal politics, empowered ordinary people to act outside of neoliberal boundaries, and rekindled faith in the democratic state as a shaper of markets? Which will it be? The answer will be what we make it. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to open it up for questions. Who would like to start?
Hi. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for another great talk. I was just curious about the effect of all of this on wealth inequality. I know we've had a big increase since the beginning of COVID, and I assume it's similar post-2008. And I don't see, again, based on what I know, that trajectory is not showing signs of reversing. So, and it's concerning because obviously long-term you get shrinking middle class and lower wages and so on. What's your view on that trajectory, and do you have any ideas of how to stop it?
Well, let me first say it should have been a more visible theme in this talk. I would have forced you to stay here even longer if I had done that. I allude to it a couple times. All right. So wealth inequality has 30 seconds on wealth inequality. It was generally believed after the Second World War that as societies developed, that they became more equal. There's something called the Kuznets theorem that articulated this. And as in reality, after the sort of Keynesian crisis of the 1970s, as wealth inequality started to grow, people were in denial about it. And then it began growing a lot in the 90s and 2000s, particularly in the English-speaking world. The financial crisis, and it is, wealth inequality is at the root. You can call it wage suppression or wealth inequality. It's the same thing. It's at the root of the financial crisis. The fact that the neoliberal economy in the United States and the United Kingdom did not produce adequate spending money in the hands of working people in the 1990s and 2000s is why why we had a financial crisis. It's the ultimate cause of the crisis. The crisis itself initially reduced wealth inequality because it crushed the stock market. Right? Corporate investments in big corporations are really what divides ordinary people from rich people. Right? And the big collapse in stock market values initially reduced wealth inequality. But then, as I said here, the use of quantitative easing to prevent a catastrophic depression, that had negative impact on inequality, made inequality worse, right? Because it pumped credit into all assets. And of course, people who had more assets got more credit, and so they ended up in a much stronger position. There is an argument about, wealth, and in the course of all of this, part of the collapse of neoliberal ideology is that it is now generally recognized by mainstream economists that high levels of wealth inequality are associated with lower levels of growth, right? That wealth inequality damages growth. In the high neoliberal era, that was not what most economists thought, but now they do. Key figure in that is Joe Stiglitz, by the way. He insisted that was true until the data eventually showed him to be right. There's a big argument about whether essentially infinitely accelerating levels of wealth inequality is inherent to contemporary capitalism or not. The person who has become kind of depressed about this and thinks it's inevitable is Thomas Piketty. I think Stiglitz and others think, and I think my colleague Mariana Mazzucato think this is a political choice. And I very strongly feel that is the case. It's a political choice. High levels of income and wealth inequality are incompatible with a democratic society. It is not just that I get to buy more groceries than you do. It's that at the levels of inequality we have today, and Elon Musk symbolized that in this presentation, the levels of inequality we have today, people can buy governments, and they do. Next question.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. You alluded to both of these countries at the start of the presentation, Ireland and Greece. If I remember the reporting at the time correctly, both were faced with a similar choice. Can you explain the difference in outcomes?
Well, the key, I am not despite having been to both countries and having been in rooms with politicians in both countries and trying to be helpful in Greece. I wouldn't call myself an expert on either, but this is my general sense of what happened. All right? At the time of the crisis, the Irish banking system and the UK banking system were significantly integrated. Right? There was an effort to rescue the Irish banking system as part of the rescue of the UK banking system. It was very hard on the Irish initially. What the Irish then did, though, in response, what the Irish government did in response was, over time, was to pursue a very intentional strategy of attracting tech companies to Ireland as a low-tax, English-speaking part of the European Union. The low-tax part made Ireland into a kind of international pariah, but the Irish didn't care as long as Google and Apple, et cetera, kept coming. And then the Irish benefited from just a piece of dumb luck, which was Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, right? And the fact that the United Kingdom left the European Union, and all of a sudden they're the only English-speaking country in the European Union, right? And they're close to America, and they've got incredibly favorable corporate tax rules, and that worked for Ireland. Greece was not in Greece's financial interdependencies was with Germany. And Germany, I think, and the debt was different, right? It was at the national level rather than in the financial system in homes and stuff. And this created a set of politics that was absolutely poisonous for Greece. And at the back end, Greece simply didn't have the options that I just described that Ireland had. It just didn't have them. And the people who run the European Union, while sympathetic, didn't actually show up with anything like what would be needed to lift Greece's productivity and to fully integrate Greece and other countries in Greece's position into the European economy in a way that would go like this, as opposed to essentially manage them. Greece's Greece's economic and financial situation at the height of the crisis was managed for the benefit of German politicians who did not want to admit that their banks needed restructuring. And Greece took the hit. That doesn't say anything about the dysfunction in Greek politics, which is extensive, right? But it wasn't actually as relevant as what I just said to what actually happened. Next.
Actually, kind of picking up on that question, one of the patterns that you've talked about in this talk and in previous ones as well is where essentially like banks are financing consumer spending in countries they export to, and that the production that is exported enables a certain quality of life for folks in the domestic country, and the debt and borrowing enables a certain quality of life in the importing country that is ultimately unsustainable. Right. I guess what are the hallmarks of your preferred alternative that might be sustainable, and is that a pattern that includes a high level of trade between those countries, or not so much, or I wonder if you could sketch that out a little bit, especially with the rise of power of trade unionism and like a focus on sort of green production now and industrial spending.
Well, that's a small question you've asked. Naya, we have people online? Yeah. No, I'm going to answer your question. I'm not trying to hide from you. All right. I think it's hard to give a single answer to that question, but I think that I'm not for autarky, right? As you can see, I think Brexit was an extraordinarily stupid idea. And regardless of the characters of the individuals involved, I made some fun of some people, but I think that Britain exiting from a large trading bloc with no plan B, effectively, other than people talking about Empire 2.0, seems like something that somebody dreamed up when they had one too many in a private club. That kind of thing is a really bad idea. I think that the challenge is to produce, as the current U.S. Trade Representative said, a trading regime that allows for balanced societies. I heard Catherine Tai, the current U.S. Trade Rep, say recently, it turns out not only can we not all be computer programmers, software engineers, but we don't want everyone to be a software engineer. It doesn't produce a stable society, right? And Ricardian sort of trade theory kind of has that tendency, right? Now, I think that, as I was alluding to in the answer to the gentleman's question before about Greece, I think that the leaders of the European Union, if they had been wiser, would have thought about how do we knit together our societies in ways that are productive and increase the productivity and economic viability of all of us from these situations, right? But in order to do that, you fundamentally have to view all of the relevant zone of political decision-making as a zone of common interest, right? That was the point about my kind of reference to Appomattox was that the United States went through a long period and quite painful period in which the concept that we all had common interests as citizens of the United States was built up out of some other things, right? And in many respects built up intentionally by skillful and ambitious political leadership, right? The thing about the financial crisis in Europe and in the United Kingdom is the failure by politicians to do this. Now, what kind of trading regime does that result in? You try to result in trading regimes that are mutually beneficial and financially sustainable, and mutually beneficial not just that I get cheap consumer goods and you get my industrial plant, right? But rather in that we both prosper together doing productive things that produce viable societies. Now, I believe very strongly in relation to climate change that really and this was the subject of my 2 climate lectures that you can see on YouTube if you haven't seen them from last month. Sustainable action on climate in the speed and scale that we need requires very active management of the relevant markets. Financial markets and massive public investment, but also active management of markets like the markets for the production and distribution of automobiles. We can't just say, well, let the market do it. Imposing tariffs, for example, which Joe Biden did today on China's electric vehicles. Imposing tariffs may be necessary in dealing with the realpolitik, but it's nowhere near sufficient, right? In terms of ensuring that you have a domestic industry that can support a politics of action on climate change. This is the kind of horror of the Tory government's indulging of Tata Steel's total shutdown of Britain's only basic steel plant, was that the political signals it sent around climate change were disastrous. Right? The politics of fighting climate change has to be fought much as the politics of fighting a war are fought, because the demands on the society and the economy of what we have to do are so significant. And trade policy has to be kind of integrated with these things. The idea that trade is, that there's something called free trade, and we just leave it be, right? It was one of the most dangerous and destructive ideas of the neoliberal era, because some people actually believed that and acted on it, or were fooled into acting on it, while other people understood that that was crazy. That wasn't how the world works. These markets are managed. They are always managed.
So in the Q&A, we have a comment coming in from a person named Kelly Kelso saying that they love your quote on not everyone wants to be an engineer and the connection to Ricardo. I think kind of building off of this remark, one of my questions is, one of the things that you bring up towards the end of your presentation is around this idea of narratives and how narratives can really shape what it becomes politically feasible. With respect to kind of thinking about Musk and the role of digital platforms and how they can shape information, and also thinking of things like Cambridge Analytica, for example, and how they shape the political discourse significantly. What do you see as being maybe a corrective to kind of the informational distortion that can happen through digital platforms, to try and make sure that we go towards the empowering end rather than destroying public confidence in democracy end?
Oh, wow, that's a lot of a question. All right, so now if you don't mind my coming back to you on that. You're asking me to talk about how one might approach the policy around digital platforms with in mind the deterioration in confidence in civic institutions that I described in the lecture. Is that, do I have it right?
Correct.
All right. I think this is a huge job. And I think this is this is what I was pointing to with this slide. I know we're a few minutes over time already. I'm glad it's not longer. I was afraid it was like 8 o'clock. I want to come back to this slide, because this is what I was trying to get at, my Elon Musk slide. These two things have melded together, right? The public distrust that was created by bailouts and by sleight of hand and by essentially lying to the public about what was going on, because, as Jack Nicholson famously said, you can't handle the truth, right? Which the truth was that the banking system had failed, right? That has blended into Elon Musk world, in which there is no truth except what Elon tells us it is. Right? Now, how do we restore some level of, how do we restore a democratic culture where there is some common sense, where some epistemological commonality, right? Where we all have some confidence that while we may not agree about things, we at least know what they are. And I think that I'll leave that slide up there because it's so much fun to look at Elon. I think to do that, we need to begin by remembering something that we seem to have forgotten as a society, a global society. And that is our memory of some level of epistemological commonality, right? Our memory that was true. That if you're English, that, once upon a time we all watched the BBC and that was truth, or that for Americans it was the New York Times or Walter Cronkite or Edward R. Murrow. that we knew what truth, or the President of the United States speaking on TV, that we knew what truth was, or the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's important to remember that these things were constructed. We didn't start there. We started with the chaos of earlier technologies. We started with, my truth is my printing press, literally, right? Everyone with a printing press is their own source of truth. By the way, a huge issue in early modern Europe is like, who gets to have a printing press and who gets to say what with one? The truth that the knowledge foundations of a democratic society are built. They're built through democratic processes. The same thing is true, by the way, how do we know when we go to the doctor that the doctor actually is competent? Right? In the social media world, if we lived in the world that Facebook and Google and Elon here want us to live in, it's a world where any fool can stand up and say, I'm a doctor, and good luck to you to try to figure out whether they actually know what they're doing. We live in a legacy world in which there are licenses and degrees and regulators, in which we have some confidence that the person who says they're a doctor is one. Right? So the answer tonight to your question is, this is a project. Right? This is a project of constructing the new world of information technology in a manner that is democratically accountable, and when we can have some trust in what we are seeing, hearing, and reading, that it is what it says it is. And if it seems daunting, just remember, it's been done before. And it seemed just as daunting to the people who did it then, in the Victorian era or in Shakespeare's time. It seemed just as daunting then as it does to us. It can be done. It has to be done if we want democratic society to survive, and if we want democratic states to be able to effectively take on the challenges that we face today, which are very great. Anything else? Any other questions? We've held people a long time.
I think that's it, unless there's another question in the audience.
I'm happy to speak to people afterwards, by the way, but I think we promised them 7 o'clock, and it's 7:10. Which those who know me know is kind of my thing, right? 10 minutes after I said.
So please join me in thanking Damon for his exciting lecture and talk this evening.
And thank you, Nye, and thank you to the people.